over here, kind of, I feel like you try to go a step further and try to use like results and race data to understand what distinguishes top runners and maybe back of the pack runners. And the way you described it is top 10 versus not top 10.
Yeah.
Can you describe a bit that research and what you found and the protocol you adopted there?
Yeah, so we wanted to develop this treadmill test battery. We knew at that point that ultra running was underexplored. So from the systematic review, it was all sort of short stuff predominantly. I was more interested in the ultra context, but we didn't know at what gradient should we test the participants at. We knew we didn't want to do 0%. Some previous researchers, Volker Scheer, Sabine Ostrom, had done 10%. But even 10% I didn't feel was great. So we wanted to do an analysis of a real world race. The best race that we had on our doorstep was Ultra Trail Cape Town. And we wanted to know, what are the athletes actually exposed to? So I contacted Stu McConaughey, who's the race director or one of the race directors at UTCT, and I owe him a lot, which I always say thank you to him for his support over the years. And I said, listen, we want to get access to your participants, and we focused on UTCT participants over the subsequent papers. And for this one, we looked at using Strava data because we couldn't use the electronic timing checkpoints that you would use in a road race, because the amount of vertical elevation gain or loss between checkpoint 1 or 2 is completely different between 2 and 3. So I looked into Strava, and obviously with Strava you can have much smaller segments. So I think the average segment length in our analysis was just over 1 kilometer, as opposed to, let's say, 10 checkpoints over 100k race, which is like 10 kilometers. So we get a much more sensitive analysis. And we took the top 10, those who had Strava data for that year, and then we took a random sample of everyone who finished outside of the top 10, and we wanted to compare their pacing over the course of the race. So the pacing was one part, because we were interested to see how that changes. But actually what we were doing secretly is seeing how fast were they running at different gradients on average, so that we could pitch the treadmill protocol at the right speeds, and what sort of gradients are they exposed to. And we decided quite early that we would clamp it to uphill running only, because in a laboratory, you cannot get a treadmill to go from 25% uphill to 25% downhill quickly. It takes a long time for motorized treadmills, and most motorized treadmills have a downhill limit at about 3%. They don't go very steep downhill. So if you wanted to go steep, you've got to put them up on blocks, and then it becomes a steep thing. And we wanted a test that at that time I thought, well, then other people can replicate it. I actually don't think that the test is super replicable, and that's fine. I'm okay with that because of the nuance of trail running environments. But what we found through the pacing analysis is that the top 10 runners tended to start a lot more conservatively than the not top 10 runners. So the top 10 runners still obviously were running way faster than the not top 10 runners. But if you take their segment speed for all of those cumulative segments proportional to their overall race speed, the top 10 runners start a lot more moderately, sort of easier, but they also finish a lot stronger. So they do sort of decay in speed as the race goes on, your classic positive sort of pacing curve that you would see. But not top 10 runners tend to sort of drop off a cliff, no pun intended, towards the end of the race. And interestingly, towards the end of the race, the not top 10 runners dramatically worsen in terms of their relative performance on the downhill sections. So we found that top 10 runners were better able to maintain their pace on these downhill sections, not top 10 runners. They were still doing okay in the uphill sections late in the race, relative to their uphill performance early in the race, but their downhill speed dramatically worsened. And I mean, that could have been at that point already a warning sign to say, oh, we need to focus on mechanical fatigue and the eccentric demands of downhill running. UTCT's got 5,000 meters of vertical elevation loss, never mind the gain. So your quads are getting absolutely shattered. But yeah, we use that to sort of also look at the relationships between uphill level and downhill. That's a nice thing about Strava. I could go and I included for uphill segments were only segments where there was only uphill running. There were no mixed segments in the uphill segments. And the same with downhill, it was only downhill running in the downhill segments. And I did a correlation, just a basic correlation between uphill running performance and overall running performance, and level running, or mixed, we called level, where any segment that had an average gradient of less than 1% positive or negative was classified as level. We correlated that performance to overall performance, and the same with downhill performance. And we found that the strongest correlate was uphill performance. But again, that's not because uphill running is more important than downhill running. It's because uphill running forms a greater proportion of total running time in any trail race. If you do a trail race that is a round race, not a point-to-point race, you're going to go just as far up as you do down. And if you consider that you're running almost twice as slow going uphill than you are going downhill, then of course you're going to spend more time in an uphill condition than you are in a downhill, because you've got to fight against gravity, raise your center of mass, and that slows you down exponentially. So we decided at that point that although the downhill is clearly very important, the uphill is more strongly related to overall performance because it represents a greater portion of overall performance. So we rather start there, and then we can always explore downhill thereafter.
Okay, so let me summarize so I see that I understood everything and go to the next question. So there were three things that you essentially found from the study. First is the way you phrased it is that top runners tend to start more conservatively compared to non-top 10 runners. When the breakdown starts happening, you see it the most when runners, especially in the non-top 10 runners, when they were running downhill.
Yeah.
However, you felt that the uphill is the performance on the uphill is the most representative or could correlate the best towards their overall finishing time or...
Yeah, exactly right. And that finding is not unique. So there's been other researchers that have looked at this pacing and have found very similarly that recreational sort of back of the pack runners, it's the back end of the race on the downhill segments where they struggle. It's just you just see these guys are just moving totally slowly because they've got so much muscle fatigue and pain and inflammation.
So why did you feel that the thing which represents performance the most is the performance on the uphill? If they slow down percentage-wise the most on the downhill? Is that a counterintuitive?
Well, it's sort of counterintuitive, but at the same time, as I mentioned, the main analysis, if you look at sort of the fixed effect, is that not top 10 runners get slower later on in the race compared to top 10 runners. So they also get slower in the level running. They also get slower in the uphill running. It's just the delta, the magnitude of the difference is larger in the downhill section. So we're not discrediting or discounting the fact that downhill running performance is important. It certainly is. But if you just look at the total amount of time spent in uphill conditions, it's a lot greater. So ideally you need both. I'm not going to lie, but downhill running is a bit tricky when it comes to physiology because the ground reaction forces are larger, the braking impulse is larger, but you don't actually see much of a heart rate response. So you can actually look like you're sort of recovering, but you're running quite hard going downhill. So again, when you're looking at physiological research, there's not a lot of it done in downhill running because of that very reason. There is existing research in uphill conditions. So yeah, it's one of those ones you sort of look at it and you think, I know this is important, but I need to make a call here. Like I can't do all of this. So yeah, that was our
Yeah.
final call there. Yeah.